oh yeah, that's that thing that happens later. Like, don't even consider that as you're doing an iteration or a sprint with the developers. Have you guys found that secret sauce yet? Or I know I have a lot to learn. Oh, you're muted, Heidi. I see your mouth moving. No, you're still muted. Here, let me help. I can unmute you. Oh, there you go.
Took a second. So sorry. I was like, I have been in several organizations over the past year, and to be honest, it's been a challenge for every single one of them. So I think this is a super relevant topic, and can't wait to hear what Phil has to say. So.
Definitely.
Yeah, personally, I've seen a multitude of approaches to this, but the general approach that I've seen for the vast majority happens in a very waterfall-like fashion within a Scrum or an Agile process. It's like, hey, development's done, start QAing this thing. But I did work in a rare instance where, we weren't actively QAing something while it was being developed, was when our QA was actually engaged in learning how that user experience was, learning the backbone of why it was being developed and the nuts and bolts, and meanwhile writing test cases in parallel to the development that was occurring. And then by the time they were really ready to get down to the nuts and bolts of testing, it was a lot more transparent for them. They knew a lot more about what they were testing, and the quality was greatly impacted. I mean, we had just like amazing quality, very low defects, and they felt much more engaged with the process. So that was the best way that I've seen it work so far.
That's awesome. I love it. I can relate to that as well, being in the meeting where they're raw, let's go Agile, and we're so excited about Agile. Now let's talk about how when development ends and they do their handoff, what kind of handoff criteria do we need to hand it off into the testing space? And kind of sitting in the corner scratching my head going, wait a minute, maybe this word does not mean what you think it means. If we're simply going to stage, we're going to be Agile in our phases and our phase gates as we step through our processes. Excellent. All right. So we are right at about time. So we're going to go ahead and kick off our notes now. So this is just a pretty quick intro to what we're doing here, Coaching Agile Journeys. You can find us at coachingagilejourneys.com. Big welcome to everybody who's joined us so far. We're targeted to get started here about 5 minutes past the hour, and we will also end 5 minutes to the hour, so we'll give you some time to get to your next meetings. All right, what we're doing today, we've got 4 to 4:05. We're letting everybody join in. We've got 51 participants right now, so that's a great turnout for us so far. Kickoff is what we're doing at the moment. We're going to hand it over to Philip here in just a second to start going over his main topic, and then we're going to close out, like I said, 5 minutes to. So we got some information about who we are as Coaching Agile Journeys. We're just a group of people who are trying to figure out how to progress down our personal Agile journeys, a bunch of Agile practitioners, and what we're trying to do is figure out ways and gather new content that can help us on our journeys and share that with you. And so again, today's topic I think is going to be hopefully relevant to all of you. Hopefully you're familiar somewhat with the controls of WebEx. If you haven't used them very much, check out that panel over on the right side of your WebEx screen. Should be a QA and a chat panel over there. You can use a chat panel during the conversation if you want to message myself or Heidi or Jeff about anything that might be wrong or if you're having any technical difficulties. And then the Q&A panel is how you'll enter in questions that will save some time at the end for Philip to answer any questions you might have. All right, so let's see, that being said, I don't think we've got any announcements for today, except that we definitely would love your feedback. So if you are interested in getting involved or engage with us, have some ideas on how we could do it better, just feedback in general, there will be a survey at the end of the webinar, and you can always reach out to us at Coaching Agile Journeys. We have our emails there as well if you want to contact us about a future event. That being said, let's go to Testing in Agile by Philip Liu. So anything, Heidi, before I hand it over to Philip, Heidi or Jeff, anything I missed before I hand it over to them? That's a pretty quick overview.
I'm ready.
Awesome. All right, guys, well, we're going to turn off our webcams and go on mute. You can still reach us in chat. And Philip, if you're there, I'm going to pass you the ball. Oh, wait, I see Jeff's hand. He's waving at me. I guess he's giving me the wave of let's get going. All right. Philip.
Yeah, I will let Philip do his thing, right?
Awesome. Thanks. We'll be back at the end. Thank you, Philip, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to your audience. Can you guys hear me all right now and see everything?
Yep. Yes, looks good from here.
Okay, great. Well, let's get started. I know our time is short, and I wanted to cover this exciting topic of testing and Agile. And as we were saying just a minute ago, sometimes, when we're converting from waterfall, I think that Jeffrey mentioned that a lot of times we get caught up in our old practices, and although we're talking about Agile and doing Agile, we're not really Agile as we hand over and get ready for test. And I think that's really what we're going to be covering today is how to migrate from that handover type concept to actually being Agile. I hope that's why we're all here. So now I've worked a lot in Agile environments as well as waterfall environments. I don't want to talk about how old I am, but I have worked in waterfall quite a bit, and in the last 10 years now, I've worked a lot in Agile. And I think that what people don't realize is that the changes that occur in migrating from one to the next are not really all rocket science in terms of technology and tools and even process. A lot of them are in your mindset. So I'll talk about the process changes as well as some of the changes that take place in our thinking and, of course, in timing. So as Jeffrey mentioned earlier, it's not about handing stuff over, but really what drives success is thinking about testing all the time. And I like to think of it as, having the right people in the right place, doing the right thing at the right time. So here, I was a few months ago, I was introducing speakers at a conference, and some of the feedback at the conference was, well, you didn't introduce yourself. So here I am. This is my LinkedIn profile. You can find me on the internet and so forth. But really, what I love to do, and one of the attendees at the webinar today actually sent me a LinkedIn invite about. She said that it was interesting to see that I'd like to satisfy my quest for exploration, and so this is me also. I like to ride and go to new places, and I think I've traveled to over 60, and my goal is to go to one country every year that I've never been to. So I am an avid cyclist, and I bring this next slide up here because I think it's really directly related to Agile. When you're really, when you're in a cycling race, you really have to be aware of everything that's going on around you. And so I kind of draw parallels between cycling and Agile and knowing what all of your teammates are doing, knowing where your competition is, knowing what place you are in the race or the sprint, and doing the right things and thinking the right strategies all at the right time. But today, I'm hoping that everyone is here to think about and talk about, Agile testing, whether or not maybe you're here because you want to know what your test plan should be. Maybe you want to know what you as an Agile tester should be doing. Maybe you're wondering if you should have test cases, things like that. And one of the things you'll notice in that second to last bullet point there is what to do as an Agile tester. And Agile is in small letters there. Agile is actually an adjective. So it didn't become a noun until recently when we started thinking about Agile as a process and as opposed to waterfall. Agile is actually an adjective. So I'd like to invite you to think about Agile as an adjective. The slides that I'm going to be presenting are quite informative and very packed with information. And so please don't expect me to read the slides. I want to include them as a giveaway or a takeaway for you because a lot of times I go to talks and they may have, one word on a slide, and the guy talks for 10 minutes to that one word, and then later on I go away and I'm thinking, geez, what did he say? I forgot, and I want to go back and review. And so I'm hoping that you can take these slides away as a review as well. I think the problem that with software is that it's really a new thing. We think we've been developing software for quite a long time, probably about 50 years now, 60 years. But actually, it's rather new when you compare it to making doors or toilets, right? There's no interfaces or common things that everybody wants that don't seem to change. And so that's why Agile has come about. And I actually think that Agile is something that we apply in our daily lives. You know, when you go to the store and you pick up some stuff to make a new dinner, you think about the past dinner when the pasta didn't turn out, or this person didn't like this kind of pasta. And you actually adapt every time, every meal that you make. And, you know, what got us here is really a lot of changes in technology and business models, converting to a SaaS business model, converting to mobile. All of those things have driven us to go towards Agile, but also many failures. So a lot of failures, and a lot of people cite those standish statistics about so many % of projects fail and so forth. And that has really driven us towards Agile. When I look at some of the experience that I've had in working with teams in the last 10 years, I would say that, you know, some of the primary things that drive people towards failure, which is one of the things that I've accumulated in terms of a list of things to do in Agile testing, are these things here. And today I'll talk about some of these things about in Agile testing, what to do, and they're going to be related directly to these points here in terms of being Agile and doing Agile, test automation, really using retrospectives as a valuable way to improve rather than just going through the motions, and then really getting close to your users and customers and understanding them. So the opposite of failure, of course, success. And so a lot of times you can see a direct correlation between these things. And so I'll also be talking about how to get users involved and, you know, how to really get a rhythm and develop a process for yourself that works for you. You know, you could read books, and those books are going to provide a good outline and things to think about, but really you have to form your own groove in Agile. And again, automation, and then really developing a consistent release practice that works for you. Some of the clients that I work with release every 2 weeks, some every month, some every quarter. And so that's something that is driven by your own business as well as your team and what you think your business needs. And lastly, of course, collaborative behaviors, which are really related to being Agile rather than doing Agile. So here, I put this up first, which is a definition of Agile, and you can see the first two definitions are adjectives, and the last definition is a noun. So I just wanted to emphasize that there, that, you know, Agile really is an adjective, not a noun. It's hard for me to see the questions come in. Isaac, are you going to be interrupting me with questions as we go, or we're going to save that to the end?
We're going to save them till the end, so if that's okay, we'll have people put them in the Q&A, and then we'll have those 5-10 minutes at the end. We'll bring those up.
Okay. I like to think of that in terms of Agile as a be-do-have paradigm, and we practiced this in high school, even though we didn't really realize it. We thought that if we got some beer and some food, that's a doing, and we went to the beach, that we would have lots of friends hang out and have a good time. And so what we forgot, what we didn't realize is that a lot of times that's really depending on who we are as a person. You got to be the nice guy. You got to be the person that's outgoing in order to get what you want to have. So it's not really just about doing, it's really about being before you can have that good time. And in Agile, a lot of times we read these books and we say, okay, we're going to have sprints, we're going to make our sprint 2 weeks, we're going to do our stand-ups, and but in the end, we expect in the end to have good quality software and have it faster than we did before. But we really don't think about these things that we're supposed to be in order to accomplish those results. And that's, you know, being communicative, flexible and willing, being willing to learn new things, taking initiative and being responsive. We know that Agile quality, you know, we've talked about, people I'm sure have heard before about having a shared team responsibility and there's no police. But what I'd like to emphasize here is that team members do what they can and do what is needed. So, you know, if a tester can do some development, then they go and do that if that's what's needed and they have the time to do that and it's been prioritized that way for them to get that done, and vice versa for developers. If developers have the skills to do some testing and that is needed, then they go that way. You know, it's not about roles, but it's about tasks that have to get done and the people that have the capability to do those tasks. Now I'm going to divide the rest of the talk today into 3 sections. The first one is on the planning section, which is all the stuff up front and all the things that we as testers should be thinking about when we during that phase. And then the next phase will be the second one, which is actually in the heat of the sprint and doing the daily scrum meetings and actually when you're actually in the development process, development and testing process. And then the third phase we're going to be talking about is the retro phase, when you're releasing the product and you are finishing the iteration, and then sit down and say, well, how do we do? So let's talk about the Agile planning phase. And so these are things to think about and things to do during that phase. So the first thing that we should plan on doing is working with other test specialists and pairing with other test specialists to increase our skills, as well as contributing another point of view to those specialists. So I think one of the things I'd like to touch on is usability. You know, usability testing does not have to be the complicated usability testing that you have with observations and recording and so forth. I like to think about what I call hallway usability testing as a really good way to implement the 80-20 rule in getting a lot of feedback on something right away, very, very quickly, that can be very, very useful with very little effort. And then the next one is about, you know, working with other domain experts and thinking about their point of view as far as, you know, business analysts and figuring out how the user thinks. I think that's really, really important as testers to really bridge that gap between developers and the customer. And of course, thinking about testing as a critical part of the plan. So, you know, when you do that poker planning and play poker and determine how long a task is going to take, testing should be part of that task. And so those kinds of things like white box testing or integration testing, time that it takes to improve or clarify stories, that all has to be planned as well. And you know, when you're doing that planning and thinking about workload, the workload is always the same. The workload that you can do is always the same. What changes is the components of that workload. And so one of the Agile principles that people seem to forget is being sustainable. And, you know, one of the things that we actually measure with some of the clients that we work with is the overtime, because overtime is just not sustainable. And so if you have a lot of overtime, overtime leads to mistakes as well. So in your planning, you know, sometimes you could actually have a planned overtime day where, you know, on a certain day you're going to focus on a certain function or a certain process component. But in general, you really want to, in order to ensure sustainability, you really want to minimize overtime. And this is kind of related to sizing jobs properly and prioritizing. So a lot of times you're going to end up having things that just fall off the plate. And I'd like to say that they should fall off the plate on purpose. So sometimes you have to purposefully take things off your plate, and that's better than at the end and you discover, oh, we didn't get to all this stuff. right? So it's better to just take all this other stuff that's not a priority off of your plate in the beginning. And also, you should be planning for technical debt, or planning to remove technical debt is probably a better word for it, in terms of looking at defects and thinking of defect verification and those effort that goes into that as part of the plan. Understanding the test basis is really important. I think a lot of people, a lot of teams don't really think that carefully about the environment especially. And so the environment and the configurations and the interfaces with the third-party modules and thinking about what gets tested on what environment is really important, and having a process around that is really important as well. And so, you know, thinking about your environments, you may have a different focus on different environments and different iterations. So it's important to plan that out. Again, as far as the testing and planning the data preparation and the documentation, we could spend 15 minutes talking about, but we won't. But the thing is that we really need to plan out the amount of documentation that we do. And it's not, you know, we're not doing detailed specs like we did back in the old days, but we're doing enough documentation, taking into account how long it will be used and who it will be used by. And all these things take time, right? So they have to be planned in. So although we don't write really detailed test cases, we do write general guidelines for tests, and that has to be planned in as well. User stories, this is probably one of the biggest ways to get upfront in terms of understanding your users. And a lot of times, you know, if you look at all these past statistics and reports and studies and so forth, they all say that defects come from requirements. Yet a lot of times we don't have enough time to look at the user stories and really plan you know, how much work is this user story going to take. And I think it's really important to get high-quality user stories in order to remove defects or prevent defects, really. So we should be, as testers, we should really be thinking about, you know, does this user story, do I understand it to know what I'm going to be testing for? And if you don't, then you need to go and talk to the business analyst or the user and clarify that, or the product owner, because that's really going to impact the whole downline, the whole downstream process. A lot of times it's really easier to understand and develop and define a user story if you have it can be related to something else already known. And that's been shown as a way that we as adults learn. We learn based on things that we already know. And so sometimes when you make a drawing or do something or show a flow, if you can relate it to something that's already known, that helps a lot in terms of understanding things. I hope I'm not going too fast. I'm trying to stay within the timeline here. We're only on number 1, and we have a little ways to go. So here we go. So I talked a little bit earlier about configurations and environments, and I call this the infrastructure. And so what we have to do is we have to plan out the data that we're going to be using and the environment that we're going to be using. And this is really important when you're dealing with compliance as far as your data goes. You know, as far as HIPAA compliance, really planning out the use of data, the cleaning of data, and what environment you're going to be testing in. And if you're going to be testing in HL7 environment where you have to be interfacing with a lot of different things, then all of that stuff has to be planned. So it's something that you can't forget about, and you know, it does take time. You know, this stuff just doesn't happen overnight. Automating data chores is something that you could be working on during the planning phase and thinking about these things. Like I said, all of this stuff is not something that happens overnight, and during the sprint, you don't have time to work on these things. So this is something that you can be doing there's a lot of stuff to do during the phase one. Testing on one environment, and sometimes you want to be testing stuff in the smoke environment, sometimes you want to be testing stuff in a staging environment, or in a development environment. You want to be doing your static code analysis and unit and component testing. So all of these kinds of things need to be planned out as far as what you're going to test and what environment you're going to test it on. And then you need to go in and automate this environment and get that going so that when things are ready to roll, you can be testing rather than trying to get something going. And one thing that's really important to think about is that you're going to be shifting focus a lot of times depending on the focus of that iteration. So sometimes you may be focusing on how stories interact. Sometimes you may be focusing on, how functions cross over each other. And a lot of times you're going to be focusing on exploratory testing. So again, be agile about being agile. And often forgotten until the end, and this really needs to be planned out, is something that is, called non-functional testing. That is testing that does not have to do with pressing button A and this should lead to printing or something like that. Something that doesn't necessarily have to do with, specs. And that is, the security of the software, performance, and these kinds of things that we often forget into the end, but they still have to be planned out. And so a lot of times you can plan these things out and work on them in different iterations. Maybe you may have a performance iteration where you focus on performance testing, and that may be one of the things that you plan out as well. And lastly, keep talking about testing here in terms of reviewing your tests, thinking about from a point of view in terms of increasing your reducing your number of false positives and false negatives associated with testing. You should always be accepting your acceptance tests. And lastly, planning for change. I think that that's one thing that, as testers, there's no longer the straight functional tester that's going to press a button and think about, mark yes or no whether or not they got the expected results. And we as testers really have to think about moving what I call upstream and downstream. So upstream means, thinking about gaining skills in automation and in performance testing and understanding those kinds of things. But we also have to focus on really getting closer to the user and understanding from a user point of view what they're doing, how they're thinking. And if we can go in both directions there, then we can really morph ourselves into what's needed to be agile. And what I'd like to think about in terms of during the sprint is to go where you're wanted and needed. And if you satisfy those two criteria, I think you're going to be doing the right thing. So during the sprint, we're going to talk about these 5 things. What do we do? Well, I said before, we do planning or pairing. We're going to be doing a lot of test-driven development, automated testing, exploratory testing, and then working on the environment along with continuous integration and getting our data in order. So I'm going to talk about each of these here. As I said earlier, we're going to be, I call it extreme testing. So a lot of times our testers will actually sit with each other and work together on test cases and work together on testing particular functions, because what they do is they really learn from each other in either an exploratory testing phase, or if they're actually going through test cases or designing test cases, because that kind of looking over each other's shoulder, it doesn't necessarily just work in programming, but when you're working together on testing test cases or going through a functionality of a program, they really learn from each other a lot in that too. So I call it extreme testing, and I think it's a fun way for testers to learn as well. Tester pairing in the heat of a sprint with developers, I mean, that goes unsaid. I think a lot of times we may think that we don't have the skills for that as testers, but it's something that we can pick up fairly quickly as far as the basics and thinking about logic, and that helps our developers to write good tests for their own code as well. And for them to think from our point of view in terms of testing, you know, what would be a good test for me to develop to in terms of developing acceptance-driven testing or development. And this is what this is all about here, as far as really getting developers on board in terms of thinking about the test that's going to be testing their function that they're writing. Automated unit testing is something that should be done, and we can actually, depending on the skills that we have, we can be writing unit tests as well as running static code. These are things that we can do as testers. Functional testing, that goes without saying. A lot of us are learning now about Selenium. And one thing I forgot to put on this slide actually is API testing. API testing is something that is really, really important these days, because a lot of times we're calling third-party tools and interfacing through translucent walls where we may be interfacing with a payment module, or we may be interfacing with another database from another system. And these kinds of things are really important as far as our automated functional testing that I forgot to put in here, but it's really, really important. Static analysis we can do, and actually there's a lot of static analysis tools that we can use to identify performance gaps as well as security problems. And of course, the standard McCabe's complexity issues that can exist in code and cause things to be either bug-laden or performance-laden. And one of the last things about the sprint and the heat of the sprint is I call it exploratory testing, but it's really structured in exploratory testing. And a lot of people think that exploratory testing is just do whatever you want. But really you should have a charter, and charters can be based on many different things. But I like to think about having charters for things like testing one particular function or one particular workflow. You'd be surprised. You know, we once tested a login workflow, and we came up with 50 different options for that. So sometimes things seem simple, but they're not. And it's important to really get in there and focus on one particular thing at a time, and then you can really, really discover a lot of potential problems. Exploratory testing time boxes, you can do these with very short 2-hour timelines or time boxes, or even take a day. So depending on the scope of what you're going to be doing in exploratory testing, you know, if you're going to be doing some performance testing, you know, maybe that would take, you know, 4 hours or a full day, whereas if you're really focusing on a particular function or one workflow, maybe your team you'd have 2 to 3 guys or gals focusing on just a 2-hour block there. And sometimes you may be thinking about in terms of the errors and the recovery from certain errors, and that may be a 2-hour block as well. As far as working on your exploratory testing, I think it's important that we learn from these. So we have a designated time box, like I said, but it's important to think about what worked and what didn't in terms, and you may discover that certain people are good at certain types of tests. So again, that gets back to go where you're wanted and needed. And think about the decisions that you make and what you did versus what you discovered, and think about, and that ties into the value that you can get from certain types of exploratory tests. Continuous integration, that probably doesn't need too much coverage here. I know that that's one of the tenets of Agile, is really continuously integrating and continuous delivery, but I like to call it continuous testing as well. So we need to be continually testing. In the first part of in the planning stage, I talked about all the different kinds of things that we could be doing, and that needs to be happening all the time. And the last stage is step 3, which is the retrospective, and I think it's a really valuable phase that we often don't take advantage of. And one of the things I like to think about is, where was time wasted? And it's a question that we don't usually ask in that way, but I think it's really important. You know, what did we test that we didn't need to test, and what did we test that was not testable, that we wasted our time, right? What tasks fell off our plate and why, right? So I talked about earlier about the planning, about just taking things off the plate to begin with. But sometimes we have stuff fall off the plate that should have been on there, and a lot of times the why will be that a lot of unplanned work came up. And those kinds of things we really need to look at and think about why we overlooked certain things, and then thinking about our automation. Is it doing what we want? So, you know, I've worked with a lot of clients on automation, and one of the goals that people have in automation is coverage and success rates and pass rates. And I try to get people to go away from that. And, you know, you need to ask yourself, the base question is automation doing what we want? So the whole goal of automation is not to pass, but to really help you to find defects. And if it doesn't pass, but it helps to find something, then that's a good thing, right? So is that going in the right direction? And then also, are you automating the right thing? So you may find that your automation code fails a lot, and that may be not indicative that you have bad scripting, but also indicating that you're automating the wrong thing. So I think that's important to think about in a retrospective. Defect analysis is always important. No matter what no matter what people say, I'm still going to say it's important, because even if you don't document defects fully, I think it's important to document them in some way, because otherwise you don't know the kinds of mistakes you're making. So, you know, a lot of times, you know, in a race, you still may win the race, but you're going to make a lot of mistakes along the way, and it's important to document those mistakes so that you can win the next time. Otherwise, the next time you may not win. And so I think it's important to think about those corners, think about the times when you should have been surging, when you didn't, how you can avoid certain mistakes. That's really important, and you can only do that through analyzing defects, as well as other metrics, which we could talk about possibly the next time in terms of software metrics, but not today. Collaboration is important to think about in your retrospective. You know, did you deliver what was expected? And if you didn't deliver what was expected, why? And so thinking about the whys, you know, why didn't we deliver what was expected? Did we not have enough time? Did we not know what was expected clearly? You know, in working with developers and collaborating with developers, you know, did we not give enough direction as far as tests that code was expected to pass? When you're working with business analysts, did you have enough interaction to truly understand a user story and write good tests? As well as with other teams. So you're going to be working with DevOps teams as well as production teams. And so, you know, was that communication seamless as well? And it's important to think about what information was missing and what was not communicated. And a lot of times that comes down to trust. And, you know, I think that, you know, we all talk about trust, but a lot of times we don't necessarily, we do not think about what trust is, or the actions that we may be doing that could generate trust or not generate trust. And I think, you know, it's a really important thing that people don't talk about. unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about what trust means and how to create an environment for trust. I'm sure there's probably whole workshops on it. It's not really just about trust falls, right? But there's a lot of things that we can do to generate trust within our own environment at home as well as at work. And, well, this is the end. Number 4 is the end. I think we've covered all 3 of these things, and now I'm going to go into just a little bit of a summary here. So successfully going Agile, I think it's just the same thing as a long-term effort in your health. You know, sometimes you're going to have setbacks and have dessert when you shouldn't. It's really, instead of a lifestyle change, when we think about our diet, it's really a work style change in terms of getting that flexibility, going to where you're wanted and needed, and developing those skills that you can do that. So it really requires a shift in thinking in terms of the timing of what you're going to be doing as a tester. Like I said, learning skills that can carry you upstream and downstream. And as far as everyone being responsible for quality, I brought that up in the beginning, that it's not about roles. You know, I'm a developer, I'm a tester, but maybe you think of yourselves as, I have a lot of skills that testing requires, or I have skills that development requires, and you go in that direction according to what is needed at the time. And as summary as a tester, Agile doesn't mean that we have no test plan, but it's a different test plan, right? So we're thinking about different things, doing different things other than just pure test case writing and pure test case execution as an Agile tester. We're flexible in the heat of a sprint. We follow a plan, but we also go to where we're wanted and needed. And so that could mean that we're actually doing some usability testing. It could mean that we're working with business analysts to clarify requirements. It could mean that we're writing performance test code. It could mean that we're writing automation test code. It could mean various things. And if we could increase our skills to do as much of that as possible, that's not only going to help us, but help our team. And the last one here is in terms of the retrospective. I mentioned that was the last point that we covered, and I think that's really, really important in terms of thinking about how we collaborated with different team members and why things fell off our plate and why our estimates didn't work out the way that we thought they would. And, you know, being able to use that as a way to improve. I've really enjoyed today, and if you guys are interested in seeking knowledge, we have a lot of information on our website as far as different white papers you can download. I'm openly available all over the place on the internet. I'm going to be doing a keynote in April at Test Istanbul on the 7 habits of highly effective Agile testing. And I hope that you've gotten a lot out of today. So that's it for today. Thanks very much.
Awesome, Philip. Thank you so much for that presentation. I've got a couple of good questions for you. We've got about 10 minutes. Maybe we could go over some questions if that works for you.
Sure.
Excellent. Okay, let me bring these up here on my screen here. All right, I liked this one that came in because it definitely reflected something that one of the testers on a team I worked with once said. The question is, in order to do automation during a sprint, don't we require a stable environment? So, for example, a user interface type of application, doesn't it have to be stable code before you can do automated testing on top of it?
Well, that's kind of related to what I talked about in terms of API testing, how that's kind of the one layer beneath the user interface. So we can be writing automated code for that, and then you can still be writing automated code for regression testing of previously released features. So a lot of times what I've seen is that automation, actually, depending on the size of the organization, they may have an automation team that works separately outside of the sprints. I don't know if does that answer the question? Okay.
Yeah, excellent. I think that's good. Good answer there. So back to your API testing, another question that came in was, how will the API testing work better when users are concentrated more on a GUI? So if the users are really just concerned about what they see, how does API testing, how does that work better when you're looking at a GUI type of an application?
Okay, well, I mean, the API testing is not going to help a user in terms of their GUI, but that does get back to what I said in terms of using what I called hallway usability testing, where you just can ask casually other people that are outside of your development team how this looks and how this operates, and if they understand what's going on within that particular function in the application that you're testing. There's a lot of times you're going to have mock-ups, or you'll have partially functioning things that you can show to people, and you can use that without writing any automation code, right, and really help out your whole team in getting feedback right away. I call it, you know, the 80-20 usability testing.
Excellent. Yes, very good. So speaking of, let's go back to automated testing. Another question we had was, if you don't have any automated testing now, what way would you recommend someone get started? So we know we need it. We saw this presentation. That's the direction we need to go. Do you have any steps that you would recommend for kicking off an automated testing campaign for a project?
Well, it's kind of a two-pronged question. It sounded like the person that asked the question was concerned about, you know, how do I gain the skills in automation? And I don't know if I should tackle that question or not, but, you know, but I think that the first thing, you know, in terms of developing an automation program, or, you know, getting started on automation for our company or for the software that we're developing, and the answer in that really lies with choosing out and picking out the things that should be automated. And, you know, you have to think about the criteria that are involved in thinking about that. So one of them would be, you know, what functions have already been developed that are relatively stable, what functions are highly used, and what functions are critical. And you're probably going to have an intersection of all three of those, and that's where you start for your automation.
Excellent. Very good. All right. I got another question here for you. Within a sprint, how much time do we budget for manual test case design, manual testing versus automated testing? How would you allocate focus for each of those, manual test design, test case design, manual testing, and automated tests?
Well, first of all, manual test case design. I would consider it to be manual test case directions rather than design. So we talked a little bit about documentation in terms of, you know, that we certainly want it to be a lot lighter. We don't have real detailed test cases like we used to have. But what we have is directions of test cases, or general outlines of what we're going to test. So I would say manual test case design does not take up a lot of time, but they're more like scopes, you could say. So that may take, you know, a few hours that you think about different user stories and how you're going to go about testing them, or a testing approach, versus, you know, traditional test case design where we're writing out all these test cases and we take days to do this, right? So that would take a few hours. In terms of the manual testing, that's going to take still quite a bit of time. And I would say, you know, that may take 40% of your time. You know, actually this whole budget question is really just around testing, you know, test case design, manual testing, automated testing. But remember, there's a lot of things, a lot of homework and a lot of background stuff that I described in terms of getting environments ready so you can actually automate the putting up your configurations and the data, and resetting your data and scrubbing data and making sure that it's ready for you to test. So those kinds of things, probably, I call them housekeeping things, those kind of things probably take up 10 to 15%. The manual test case design, another 5%. Manual testing, another 30 to 40%, and then the rest of it would be automated testing.
Excellent. That's a really nicely detailed answer. And a follow-on question to that from the same person, but another one that I've also experienced in my own teams. If you're automating at every sprint's work, so the development team is developing something and then you're targeting automation within the same sprint, how do you compress the done cycle so that the dev work, let's say the dev work slides during the sprint towards the end and you don't have time available for automation because you want to develop it and automate it in the same sprint, but the dev work slid for one reason or another? How do you recommend handling that?
Yeah, well, that gets down to definition of done. And so if your definition of done is that it's been coded and it's been tested, then you can still be done if you test it manually. So, you know, that depends on the organization and how they want to handle that. A lot of the teams that I work with, you know, definition of done is coded and tested. And so, you know, that automated test may just have to wait until the next iteration, and the automated test would be put in at the task list and have an estimate on it, just like defect verification should have an estimate on it. So getting back to definition of done, really.
That is a exceedingly brilliant answer. I've got to say, it makes so much sense, and one that I hadn't thought of as we were going through that same problem in our teams. Thank you for sharing that. Very, very good takeaway there. A couple more questions here. So one question came in, please elaborate why test cases are not necessary. If not designed, should we use the acceptance criteria as test conditions? Also, if no test cases are created, what do we use as regression test cases for major releases?
Well, like I said before, we're not, maybe we can just define a test case differently, that a test case is really a, like I said, testing direction or testing approach with acceptance criteria. And so really we just need to think about, you know, a general functionality that we want to achieve, and if a user story is satisfied, and we can still use those as regression test cases. And in a way that gets down to what I said earlier, is that we have to move upstream and downstream as testers, and that we really have to understand the business and the domain. And if you have a good understanding of the business and domain, you can write a little bit less down, right? So, you know, in the past we thought about trying to, you know, we're not machines, right? We were trying to be more intelligent about what we're doing, and that requires domain expertise, right? And so, and that goes along with not writing down every little detailed step of a test case. You have to like trust in ourselves of what our capabilities are to do testing, as well as your coworkers, and just you know, you just can't write down every step. It would just take forever, right? So you can't do that in Agile.
Wow. Philip, I believe I'm speaking for our whole audience today. We had a lot of people here, and I just want to say thank you. These are really, really good content and excellent answers to all these questions. So thank you so much for taking the time to share this with us. And we're right at 5 minutes till, so a little bit over there. But I do want to say thank you to everyone for joining in, and a big thank you, Philip, for presenting this really quality information for us. Our next presentation, for those of you who would like to join us, is going to be April 18th. We have Michael Hannon speaking on the 3 high-impact techniques you can use to accelerate projects. I've heard Michael Hannon in a few other webinars. You don't want to miss it. He's really, really great. So you can register for that at coachingagilejourneys.com, and we'll have a post-event survey. If you have any ideas for future meetings or want to connect with us, please do, and we look forward to serving you in future meetings. So again, Philip, thank you so much. We really did appreciate it today.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.